Hello, everyone, and I assume fairly hardcore channel fans are the ones who are tuning into this video here, because I wanted to cover something that I think is rather important as a booktuber to be very transparent about. And, you know, I frankly, honestly encourage other booktubers to make a similar type of video as well, because it'll probably help your audience understand where you're coming from as a reviewer, even when they very much so disagree with you or don't exactly enjoy your type of review style. And that is this video here, which is an entire examination of just how I approach reviewing a book. I want to get this out there and make my thoughts going into a review as clear as possible. Now, I will also caveat all of that by saying that I usually approach every book a bit differently, right? Because I try to adjust expectations depending on the status of the book, the author's intent I tend to pick up on. All kinds of things can definitely shift how I'm going into a review. But in general, in broad strokes, here's how I approach a review in terms of my style. Personally, what I tend to weight the most and spend the most critical time thinking about is not necessarily narrative beats. And if you look at my comment sections, a lot of people tend to pick up on this. A lot of people comment like, you didn't really touch on the story at all, you know, why didn't you get into X, Y, and Z? And there are a few reasons for that. The least substantial, but one that does play a factor, is generally that's spoilers. And I don't enjoy doing spoiler reviews for most books that much. There are exemptions for this. Typically, epic fantasy is more tempting for me to do a very large spoiler review for, because, you know, there's a lot more weight there. But I tend, as a reviewer, to focus more on lore around the world and how interesting that is, because for me as a reader, lore is a very large player into how much I can really invest into a fantasy story. Character itself and character development, I definitely care about, as well as character relationship. I would say in terms of my biggest fault as a reviewer is the fact that I weight character relationships probably like 10 times higher than almost any other normal person would. I focus on relationship like no one's business, and I'm very aware that there are a lot of people out there who don't really care about interrelationships between people. But for me, the drama, the narrative beats, all these other things that I invest in the most as a reader typically come from character relationships, whether it's friends, enemies, mentors, parental figures, etc., etc. How well those are developed really are a huge factor into whether or not I'm going to personally love and enjoy a story. That is not to say it's like the end-all be-all and I can't still enjoy a story if I thought the relationships were weaker, but I want that to be apparent so that if I'm saying, you know, I didn't find the relationships in the story deep enough for me to fully invest and it resulted in all these other issues, I want to make that very clear so that you as a viewer of me can understand, well, I don't weight that necessarily as much, so no, I might actually be fine with this. And that's really important, right? Like, there's a big part of like transparency there. There's no such thing as an objective review. Me as a reviewer and all of the reviewers out there, we just have to make our own taste, style, and preferences as apparent as we can, so then our viewers and subscribers and followers can latch onto their base understanding of where we're coming from and judge it against where their preferences lie. That's something I've covered before, but is truly key to this reviewer-viewee relationship. And I'm just gonna be honest, like, yes, of course I care about the plot of a story, like that's gonna make or break it for me for many reasons, but in terms of a review getting into narrative beats, I just don't see a lot of value there. Because one, it's gonna turn off a lot of people from watching the review because they don't wanna hear spoilers if they haven't already read it. I'm gonna flat out admit that does play a role. But from there, I mean, yeah, if I just get into like, yes, the plot goes to A to B to C to D to E, that doesn't tell you a whole lot. I feel like it tells you way more about your potential enjoyment of a book if I can get into the atmosphere, how it felt. Because you can retell the same story 10 different ways, and if all the factors around that specific narrative are different each time when it comes to writing, you know, character, as we said, lore, etc., etc., it's going to drastically change or completely change your enjoyment of that exact narrative. So I just don't see hitting specific plot beats in a review as necessary to fully convey whether or not it might be worth for you to read. I would much rather get into the tone or the author's prose, because for me, that's going to play a wider role into enjoyment of a story. Because we've seen the same stories told again and again and again. The action movie genre has probably told that like Agent Gone Rogue story 1,000 times, but a few of those tellings stand out because everything around it was done better. That's something I kind of take into my book reviews as well. And I'm not saying anyone's wrong for weighting specific plot beats and elements more than I do. That's a preference. I would just rather talk about the elements around that skeleton that is the narrative and really get to how this story presents itself to you. And that brings me to another thing I tend to weight pretty heavily, and that is atmosphere. I've actually seen this in like Reddit threads where people are talking to me as a reviewer, and what they'll say, and actually kind of inspired me to make this video, is Daniel seems to really value lore, character, more than anything else. And one of the things they left out was atmosphere. And I just want to say that that is something I, again, hold up oh so high, like really, really high. For me, an author's ability to use their language to make this world not just have a bunch of facts that you can go, oh, I know a bunch about this world, but actually plant you in it and then make it feel like something visceral. That is so valuable, and that's why I really enjoy authors like Scott Lynch, who I think really specialize and put a ton of energy into that specific thing. And this is something that I actually think I'm gonna have the most people flat out say, like, I don't really care about that, because there are a lot of very popular authors who don't put a ton of time in immersing you in their worlds in this very specific way, and they have legions of devoted followers. And there's even authors who don't craft brilliant atmospheres every time I do enjoy, but it's why I will value a King writing style so much more than I think a lot of typical fantasy fans will. Because while there are many popular fantasy stories out there that are rock solid in almost every element, the author didn't put as much effort as I would typically enjoy as planting the reader in this world, getting them wet, because instead of actually throwing the reader in the world, their writing style more is just like putting a tapestry on a wall you can look at. But yes, that's a beautiful tapestry. So many things about it are built magnificently, but I don't feel in it in the same way that some authors who actually seem to just really grab and throw you in are. A great example of this is ERIKSON. I clash with his writing style, and something I've hit on many times, because I don't find Malazan to be the most atmospheric story in a way where I feel in it. There's an atmosphere to Malazan, don't get me wrong, but ERIKSON's specific writing style does not plant the reader in the story as much, so you're kind of disconnected from even the atmosphere work he does do. So okay, almost all this stuff you were probably aware of as an audience member who cares enough to even watch this video, right? You've picked up on the fact that I don't really hit on narrative beats super heavily because I just don't value narrative as the most important part of a story. I talk about character a lot. I talk about character relationships quite a bit and how integral they are to my enjoyment. Atmosphere, you've heard me hit on, and tone, and I've put more effort into discussing themes recently. But one of the elements of a review I value quite highly that I think might result in my reviews being different than some others, but is rather hard to fully pick up on because I'm not directly addressing it in the review itself, is the context of the author and the author's intent. I don't often talk about this in depth because it's a very subjective, I'm trying to interpret it from the outside thing, but if I'm reading an author's debut novel, I'm valuing that and reading that book in a different way than if I'm reading someone's 15th. Like, right, like picking up the latest Brandon Sanderson book is gonna be different than picking up some indie author self-published. This does not mean I'm still not being critical of this self-published book. I'm just keeping in mind that maybe this author's still working on their style, still finding how they're going to write. And I'll incorporate that in a review and say maybe it does still feel a bit rough around the edges. But if I then go and read a Sanderson novel, there's kind of a few aspects to the review that don't exist for someone who's new to the genre, right? Like, if all of a sudden it feels like Brandon Sanderson's going down a path he hasn't before as an author, or taking a stylistic turn, that is a whole other aspect to the review you cannot bring in for a new author, or an author you're just not familiar with. Like, Guy Gavriel Kay has been around for a long time, but I can't speak on his writing the same way I could Sanderson's because I've only read one of his books. And this kind of ends up going onto the shoulders of the reviewer a little bit. You kind of need to have a better understanding of me as a person of experienced fantasy knowledge to say, oh, this is his first Guy Gavriel Kay, therefore, yeah, I can still appreciate a lot of aspects of his review, but you also need to be aware of there might be certain things that I don't pick up on until the third Guy Gavriel Kay book, and then I can really begin diving into deeply. I mean, you can absolutely review an author's work better once you are more familiar with that author as a whole. I will be able to provide a more deep and thorough review of, let's say, the next Brent Weeks release, because I am very familiar with his style, how he's grown as an author, what he seems to be striving to accomplish with his work, than I am from, let's even just say, someone who I do know quite well, but Evan Winter, because Evan Winter has one book I've read. I like that book, I've reread it, but I'm still very much so looking to see how much Evan has leveled up for his next release, or maybe he drops the ball. I'm not saying that's going to be the case, I don't think so, because he showed so many rock solid foundations to Rage of Dragons, but you know, there's definitely a chance that an author can have a one-off and then they kind of fall off from there. there. And this also hits on something that I've seen many people bring up when seeing me review authors I haven't come in contact before, especially first time published, and that's that I seem to give a lot of praise for people who are doing something a bit different. Like Poppy War is not going to be everyone's flavor because, you know, it has weaker prose style, it's really grimdark in certain ways, and it wasn't until the second book that the series really reached a new height that I think actually is why it's getting such across the board praise. But I also, in my reviews, have made it clear I really love this book for doing something that I think is daring, having a lens that a lot of other books lack, and so I raise it much higher than I will and talk about it in a way more deep than I do necessarily just, you know, the next Lightbringer. And I think that comes down to another just thing with me as a reviewer. I get really excited when I see an author with a fresh face, who's someone who hasn't been around for a long time, and brings in something new to the table, something that I feel is going to shake things up, maybe influence other authors who could learn from them. And that to me is so exciting. It's so interesting to see how a fresh face can shake up the game. Of course, an experienced author who's been around for a long time can drop a release that's completely different, makes waves, and changes fantasy or changes, you know, their entire audience's perception of them as an author. I even had that happen with me with Mark Lawrence, where I got through Prince of Thorns, I read Prince of Fools, but it wasn't until Red Sister that I finally went like, oh damn, this guy is bringing something that I love to the table. I really liked Prince of Fools still, but man, Red Sister for me was like, this is my vibe. This is where I'm looking at Mark Lawrence in a whole new lens. And so while an established fantasy author can certainly bring in something new and can really change up the game with their works, in fact, they probably have a statistically higher likelihood of doing so if they're going to try something drastic and different because they'll get recognized, like Black Leopard, Red Wolf was a really big splash because Marlon James was an established person at this point. I have a bit of a bias for seeing new authors find success doing that as well, because to me it's just that recognition of someone coming in and doing something great with no clout to start them off from. Like, it's just like a level of respect I have for that, and I really enjoy seeing an author just come in for the first time, drop a mic of a success and be like, check that out, it's awesome, and being able to walk away. And then watching their careers from there also can just be stupendous as well. But the fact that the author isn't someone who's a monolith within the community makes it more interesting to me. I don't know why, it just does, and I'm just being transparent about that. That's the whole point of this video. I want to kind of just have a few things I've noticed about myself as a reviewer, address some comments I've seen directed towards me, because I feel like having the most transparent relationship between reviewer and reviewee possible is really important, because I very much so appreciate the fact that people spend money based off what I say. And every time I see a comment that's someone going like, I picked up this book off your recommendation, didn't love it, that sucks, because I know that person spent their hard-earned cash in a way because of me, and they didn't get the level of enjoyment they could have from another book. And it's impossible for me to prevent that from happening every time, right? Like, that's gonna happen. But I could maybe minimize it by saying, like, evaluate where you sit as a reader. Take a moment, take an hour to just sit down and think, what constant things within books do you tend to appreciate a lot? As I've said, for me, it's relationships, it's character itself, it's atmosphere, it's tone, you know, prose style is something I'm appreciating more and more recently, and I'm going to continue to develop as a reviewer. Over the years, I'm going to value things differently. You could see me being a totally narrative-driven reviewer 5 years from now, but I'll make that apparent as the change occurs. And just do the same for yourself. Sit down and think, you know, am I a very plot-driven person? Am I someone who, above all else, is looking for the next twist, trying to predict the story? Or no, maybe you really just like pacing. Maybe pacing is something you really value. Let me know. And actually, I'm going to be looking in the comments to see what people have to say, because I think that is a question that not a whole lot of people address about themselves as readers. And I think if you take the time to do that, I think you might be able to improve your TBR from here, because you can look up, you know, oh, okay, this book I'm thinking about reading, what are people saying about this specific element I tend to think about a lot? And if that's actually a really big weak spot, even though generally the book is talked about positively, you could know maybe to skip it. Weird video, I just wanted to do this because I think it's important, and it might be like a once a year thing where I reevaluate like where I'm sitting as a reviewer. I don't know, but it's a fun thing to do. Like and subscribe if you have not already. Hit the Patreon if you want to support what I do here. And have a good one, y'all. Peace.